We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
Before looking into songs that were part of the civil rights movement, it is first of all important to understand what it was. So first, let's define it. The civil rights movement was a movement to ensure that African Americans have equal access to basic privileges and the rights that every U.S. citizen has. In 1868, the 14th Amendment allowed black people equal protection under the law, and in 1890, they allowed them to vote. Many white people were unhappy with these changes as they saw that people who were once their slaves were now legally equal to them. In an effort to marginalize and separate black people, Jim Crow laws were implemented in the South. This means that black people could only go to certain schools, they could not use the same public facilities as white people, marriage between the two races was illegal, black people were not able to vote since they could not pass voter literacy tests due to lack of education, and it would be challenging for them to get jobs or buy a house. So now let's take a look at what happened with the civil rights movement in the 1950s. So first, let's look at Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an African-American woman who refused to give up her seat to a white man on the bus and was arrested. Her arrest spurred outrage and support, and she was put as one of the faces of the civil rights movement. As a result of her actions, the Montgomery Improvement Association boycotted the Montgomery bus system and was able to get the Supreme Court to declare segregated seating unlawful. In 1954, the Supreme Court made segregation in schools illegal, and the Little Rock Nine, which was a group of black students, volunteered to go into a white school, encouraging more colored students to do the same. And now let's look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So the first big event that happened was Woolworth's lunch counter in 1960. This is when 4 black college students wouldn't leave Woolworth's lunch counter until they were served. Soon after, hundreds of people started doing the same and boycotted the restaurants where black people wouldn't be served. Eventually, they got what they desired. This is when students got involved in the civil rights movement. A second large movement was the March on Washington, which happened in 1963. This is one of the most well-known events of the civil rights movement. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech, I Have a Dream, in which he discussed his goal of having equality between African Americans and white people. In the event, 200,000 people, black and white, marched peacefully in Washington, wanting a civil rights legislation as well as job equality. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which was started by John F. Kennedy, that allowed for equal employment as well as controlling the use of voter literacy tests. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed, which means there were no more voter literacy tests that prevented almost every African American to vote. Lastly, in 1968, we have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and days after his death, the Fair Housing Act was signed, which stopped housing discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and national origin.
Music played a big part in the civil rights movement. Civil rights groups relied heavily on music, so much that Martin Luther King Jr. said music was the soul of the movement. In fact, during long protests, individuals in both courtyards or jail cells would rely on singing and humming to keep unity and energy amongst the crowd. Singing was also an important part of opening and closing ceremonies, as vocal unity helped relieve anxiety and nerves amongst a diverse crowd.
During the civil rights movement, Odetta was a prominent musical figure. She was most known for her song "Oh Freedom," which is sang in March 1963 in Washington, where African Americans fought for their civil and economical rights. The message conveyed through this song is that African Americans will not stand to be treated unequally. As clearly stated within the lyrics of the song, it would rather be worth dying than be spent the rest of their lives in slavery. Thus, the African Americans are standing up and fighting for their freedom, refusing to let slavery continue. Every stanza ends with the same line, "And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free," stating they are free in heaven unlike in real society. The reason why the song is very repetitive is so that everyone can learn the lyrics faster and join in to sing along while protesting.
The tone in the song "Oh Freedom" displays confidence as well as a strong attitude towards their beliefs, which are consistently supported all through the song. Also, throughout the whole song, the singers are confident in their freedom, hoping that they are not going to have to deal with worrying about injustice anymore. The background singers sound very powerful, and makes one think how it wasn't just one person standing up for this. It was a community, a group, and one giant family.
The tempo of the song starts at 88 beats per minute and ends at 108 beats per minute, which means that the tempo gradually gets faster, symbolizing people gaining more motivation and power and singing more passionately. The song is andante, so that people can walk to the tempo of the song while protesting. Each stanza uses the typical color and sports format, one single line of text answered by a repetition of the chorus in each verse. This song has a major key, as the chords sound brighter and cheerful.
The song captures the aspirations and frustrations of African Americans during this period. Even though Sam Cooke admits that he's living in a world in which he's being discriminated, he has hope that soon living conditions will change and life will become easier. As this song was written during the Civil Rights Movement, when change regarding racism was finally starting to happen, Cooke is giving hope to his audience, motivating them to have a more positive mindset. In this song, there is a lot of instrumentals compared to the other song being a cappella. This song would be played more in gatherings, while the previous song was sung while walking in the streets. This song was written to motivate the African Americans and give them hope for a brighter and better future.
Sam Cooke used a combination of instruments in order to convey different emotions throughout the song. For instance, he used the violin to create a feeling of sadness, but the overall tone of the song is generally very hopeful.
This song is in the key of B-flat major. The song is 3 minutes long and has a tempo of 170 beats per minute, which remains constant throughout the whole song. The genre of this song is rhythm and blues, which is a form of popular music of black origin which began in the 1940s. This genre of music has additions driving rhythms taken from jazz, which is present in this song.
The reason why Sam Cooke chose to write a jazz song is because all black people can connect with this genre of the song. Since they were the ones who invented jazz, the song could connect to them and show their power and personality through their passions and traditions.
There were many other prominent musical figures during the Civil Rights Movement, such as Pete Seeger, Nina Simone, and Charles Albert Tindley. Charles Albert Tindley wrote one of the most popular songs of the Civil Rights Movement called "We Shall Overcome." It was played in many of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches as it brought a lot of emotion and encouragement.
To conclude, music played a very important part in the civil rights movement. Civil rights activists were very courageous as they stood up for what they believed publicly and led many African Americans while at the same time receiving multiple threats and facing a lot of discrimination. Music is something that gave them more power. They played it at rallies, marches, and protests to boost people's morale and unify them, giving everyone a sense of power and courage. According to Obama, the civil rights movement was a movement sustained by music, and while the music was inspired by the movement, it also gave strength in return. Thus, we can say that music was a huge factor that allowed for the civil rights movement to happen, and as a result, America has now had an African American president. Even though racism still takes place today, compared to how conditions were before, when African Americans were discriminated, even by the law, we can say that we as a society have made a lot of progress, something which could not have happened without the civil rights movement that was largely based on music. Thank you.
It's been a long